Joining me on the podcast today is the managing partner of Ernst & Young Real Estate and Construction and a key voice in the debate on better cities, Selina Short. Welcome to the AutonomousNow podcast and to Lend Lease headquarters here at Barangaroo.
Thank you, Jason. It's absolutely lovely to be with you and catching up on one of my favourite topics. And also, as we're saying, spectacular to be back down here at Barangaroo. Gorgeous sunny day. And after a brief hiatus, I think I was down here February 2020 last.
Wow. Yeah.
In your building. So how the world has changed since then, and it's great to be here.
Look, I must say, it's so nice to be walking around now and see people out and about. It's been a beautiful day here in Sydney today. And I feel in the last few weeks, the city is starting to return to normal a bit. More and more people are coming to work. There is an amusing trend that the peaks seem to be Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, as opposed to Mondays and Fridays, which seem very unpopular days.
They are. They are. And funnily enough, the research we did sort of predicted that, and it has come out exactly as per what was predicted, that yes, Mondays and Fridays are a little quieter, but even they're sort of bumping up a bit than they were. Yeah. So it's interesting, but I think it's evolved very organically, and now we're starting to see a few areas of focus around how do we flatten that curve a little bit now.
And I think a lot more people are starting to realise that 24-hour Zoom or video conference is starting to lose its luster a bit, and that you sort of need to be with people in order to be creative. You need to be with people to create value. And Rob Stokes came on this podcast a while ago and was talking about the risk of running on fumes because the connectivity between people is starting to wear thin. Is that something that you're seeing?
Look, I think we've drawn down on that culture well that we had built up, pre-February 2020 last year. So that kind of got us through, and a heap of adrenaline and some great technology, which allowed us to do it.
Absolutely.
I kept sort of, reflecting during COVID. Can you imagine if this had happened 10 years ago or even 5 years ago? It would have just been game over. We just would not have been able to continue on. So the fact that the technology allowed us to power through was incredible. I think the real challenge, though, comes from missing that human-to-human connection. And I like the other day, I had a couple of days I was working from home, just had, back-to-back sort of Teams calls. And by the end of it, and I'd forgotten because I was so used to that for such a long time. And when I came back into the office the next day, it's just like, you feel like you've got that more spring in your step, but you don't even really recognise until you come back that that's a thing, that you've been in that sort of a bit of a just getting from one.
I found myself actually dialing into a phone conference bridge the other day for the first time in, I suppose, years.
That's intriguing.
And I found it very odd. And I found myself sort of looking at my computer screen, expecting to see something on it and not seeing anything at all. And sort of realizing how almost outdated that is now. And really, it was only a few years ago we were using that for international conferences or international calls. So anyway, but I digress. We jump straight into it. But before we get into the research you're doing at EY and more broadly and your views on cities, I wanted to talk a little bit about you and how you got to where you are. So you are a passionate advocate for cities. You're a senior executive in this town. What drove you to that? How did you get to it?
The passionate advocate for cities piece is an easy part to answer. The rest might be slightly more complex, but I love cities. I just, it's nice to go out to the countryside every now and then, day or two max, and I'm probably ready to come home. I am a genuine cityphile. I love cities, the rich complexity, and you think about. I lived in London for 7 years. And did a lot of travelling around Europe, and like all good Aussies have travelled around, most corners of the world. And it's the cities that really intrigue me. And what I love is, you walk through a city like London, you've got buildings standing there that have been there for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, this rich tapestry of the built form and how it can bring out the best in people, and you create these human experiences. So the opportunity to create this legacy and to create environments that allow humans to ultimately, thrive is what, drives me and gets me out of bed in the morning. The rest of it has all just emerged. And I've been at EY, funnily enough, for coming up to 12 years, which shocked me. I joined for 2 to 3. That had been my modus operandi until that point. And I joined them in London, and it kind of shocks me to think that I've been here for over a decade. But the interesting bit about EY is basically every 2 to 3 years you're doing something quite different. Been back in Australia for about 10 of those 12 years, and the market here is incredible. I think in the real estate sector, there is, such a good competitive collegiate group, and we all know each other. And I think the way the industry here has led around green buildings and some of the incredible developments we've seen, like Barangaroo, which is a global case study, have been phenomenal. So the ability to be able to work with that sector and really, deliver on that promise around creating incredible cities is what I love.
I think that's a really interesting insight around how cities have transformed over time and the value of sort of heritage buildings in the fabric of new parts of cities. I think the argument in Sydney for some time was that we didn't value our heritage buildings as much, and we ended up knocking them over, and that allowed for the city's growth, versus Melbourne, which did value its heritage buildings but perhaps kind of didn't enable its growth. I think we now have the balance sort of right in how we're trying to manage things. I will say at our Circular Quay Tower project, the Jackson's on George, which is a place I used to frequent, and I will admit that on this podcast.
I went there the night I got my HSC
there
results.
You go.
When it got demolished, I did shed a little bit of a tear for the nostalgia that was.
So there is a little bit of social fabric in that. And in terms of your time at EY, how has the firm changed in terms of cities? I mean, you advise across a broad range of areas. You've got quite a large portfolio in terms of real estate and construction and hospitality, which are all sort of linked. Why did you pick that particular portfolio?
Look, and interestingly, my portfolio is broader than that, which might shock you when I tell you what else is in the portfolio, because I sit on the exec. And within that, we've taken a very unique approach around creating these almost sort of mega sectors. Now, some of what I tell you we put together won't necessarily make sense through a city lens, but we have power and utilities, oil and gas, mining and metals, and real estate and construction sits under me at an exec layer.
Wow, okay.
Now, I've got folks that run, mining and oil and gas and all those important things. The reason we put those businesses together, because they're physical asset, capital intensive businesses, and a mining site and a construction site definitely have things in common and to learn from each other. So we're looking for those crossover points. But one of the areas where we most feel that group has work to do is around the decarbonisation agenda. They are all major emitters just because of the nature of what they do. So we did that 3 years ago, where we stepped back and said, what do we want to do around how we think about solving for these really complex problems? And so I will tap into, across the firm, but work really closely with the power and utilities folks around the energy transition and what that means for buildings, construction sites and mining sites, taking those lessons learned. Within the real estate and construction piece more broadly, that has been a real global focus for us. So we work with MIT in Boston, and I manage that relationship, and we work with their Real Estate Innovation Centre, which focuses on both, property and construction, to really try and drive that innovation agenda in whichever way we're looking at that across our business. So we've got a group of us globally that work and connect up around really trying to think about thinking forward around what is going to change around cities, what is going to change around that agenda. And we've worked really closely with MIT over that journey. And we did, if I think back to, it was probably about, it was 2.5 years ago now, we bought MIT over here from Boston, and we had a number of execs across the industry, but also disruptors, and we brought them together into our innovation centre to really say, what is real estate going to look like in 2030? And so that's what's really driven us, is this forward-looking perspective on real estate. It's fascinating. I went back and looked at all of the stuff that came out of that not long ago, and you're like, tick, tick, tick. Yeah, it's just sped up.
It has. And, at Lend-Lease, we're focused on this as well. Our digital CEO, Bill Rue, the whole idea around moving towards, autonomous buildings, digital twin development, file to factory construction is all part of this move towards a digitized world, a digitized economy, but also more one that's driven by sustainability.
Completely. And, the reality is on that digital side, as we know, and this is kind of, there are times when I feel like I'm hitting my head against a brick wall sometimes with the real estate and construction sector. I'm not going to lie. I love it deeply, but it can be immensely frustrating at points. And the sector has been slow to digitize. And we get it. We understand why. It is complex. The complexity of the ecosystems, the challenge around scalability with the differentiation you get across the assets, it is really, really complex. So you understand why they've been slow, but also the sector at times, let's face it, it's probably been a bit fat and happy, and you've been able to make money through keeping on doing same old, same old. But I think that moment of truth really has dawned in that last, 24 months. And if we didn't know it, we certainly did when COVID came, the importance of technology as the enabler. And the piece around, as you say, the climate change bit, like that is what is going to save us on that agenda. And so we really need all those digital technologies working for us in the built environment if we're going to be able to get there and deliver on those net zero commitments.
And I think there's a few other things, at least at our firm, that's driving us, which is around safety, for example, in construction. That has always been a number one priority here. And right the way from our chief executive down, that's always been a focus. And then the sustainability angle for us is not a new thing for Lendlease. Like this precinct, Barangaroo, was the first carbon neutral precinct. It was a thing that we pushed and our investors wanted us to push hard. And so now I think digital is the next, I suppose, mountain to climb in terms of getting there. And partially because I think the whole creating better cities, creating better places, really involves better integration of bits of cities, right?
Yes.
So, you see that through transportation linkages and the recent Sydney Metro contract with integrated stations, for example, something that in Asia is pretty common. In Australia, relatively new, right? Surprisingly, right? Or precincts around stations. Like what do you locate around a precinct? These sorts of questions are now, I think, becoming more commonplace in our property market and infrastructure market that perhaps have been around overseas for a while. But I think the value we can bring to it is that focus on sustainability, is that focus on digital that perhaps hasn't come in some of the other markets we work in. Is that an observation you'd agree with?
Yeah, look, I do agree with that. I think the ability to be able to think about the role that digital can play to get better environmental outcomes, greater productivity, but ultimately as well, better human to human connection. And despite the fact that I think that real estate is all about humans, right? That's why we build these places for humans to come and be and live and work and play. Sometimes that is not as front and center when we think about how we then enable that experience. So how are we going to create the human experience within that building? How do we ensure that when people turn up to work or live somewhere or shop somewhere, they can do that, in the most enjoyable, joyful or productive? What is the outcome we're trying to create for the humans to come into that space, and how do they interplay? And the digital piece absolutely has to be that connective tissue that runs throughout if we're really going to change the game on that human asset interplay. It's got to be there. And I think the other bit is bringing different skills and thinking into the property sector so that when we're doing those developments, when we're thinking about the potential of those assets, we really are thinking about the role of the people that are going to occupy them. And I remember for years, going back, we did the first report on the megatrends in real estate. It's probably 5 or 6 years ago now. And when we were doing the interviews for that, I distinctly remember talking to, key execs across the sector, and you'd say, talk to me about your views on customer. And there would be a little bit of like, who do you mean? Like the investors or the person that signed the lease? I'm like, no, the people that are going to come and be in your buildings. Yeah, who are going to come and be in your buildings. Now, that's been a radical change. Like everyone now talks about customer and is very much understanding that is the people that come in.
And there's sort of different types of customers. I think that recognition of the segmentation is coming.
Absolutely. And there's the layers, and you've got to be able to, keep your investors happy and make sure the people that are signing the leases are happy. But ultimately, if you have people coming into your assets, they're engaged, they're productive, they love the space, the other two will kind of look after themselves.
Yeah. That's sort of a great segue actually into COVID, which of course has disrupted this wonderful sort of picture we're painting of cities.
Yes.
You described in one of your articles social isolation as a productivity killer, right? And I can't think of, and perhaps it might be my personality. I suspect it ours that sitting at home is comfortable for a short period of time, but then starts to become quite exhausting over time. Why is social isolation a productivity killer in your mind?
And look, and I think we've just got to, in definition wise, when we're talking about social isolation, we're talking about sort of genuinely, not just you could be sitting at home working very productively and extremely happy. You wouldn't then be like socially isolated. That's when you're identifying like, I feel isolated. That is, what is going on for you from a mental health perspective. And if you feel like that, we know that the health consequences and the work and productivity consequences are significant. There's that great stat that gets wheeled around, but it's the equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It's a great one. The health impacts of social isolation are the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And I do wonder and worry about what we're going to see in the longer term impacts as we see COVID play out. And we've already seen a number of the statistics coming through around the mental health impacts for COVID. But as people, get into this behavioural change, how do we understand the impact that's having on them personally, on their work? And we've been doing some fascinating research on another project. And in this project, we were looking at, that return to the office piece. And there was a cohort of people that just hadn't come back at all. Like, despite the fact our offices and CBDs have been open and, safe and for quite a while now, there's some people that have just not returned. And so the question is, why? What's going on for them? And you talk about sort of the health and safety aspects of Lendlease. From an employee safety point of view, there's something on all of us as employers to understand, are people safe in their home environments? Are they in the right working environment, both physically but also mentally? So I think that is going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. And I think that is one of the sort of the sleeping issues in this that we will have to face into.
Because I sort of feel there's a bit of mixed messaging, though, by the broader community. So you have people like us who say, look, we've got to get back into the office. This is where value is created. This is where productivity works. This is where you create corporate culture. These things I firmly believe in. But then you sort of read in the media that certain firms are saying, we've told our employees they never have to come back again. You can work at home forever. We're not worried about any of these issues. It all happens. And they tend to be tech-related firms, I suppose. Is there a differentiation between the type of firm that's thinking like this, or is it just a bit of media?
Look, I think it is really fascinating because, as you say, there are quite extreme perspectives, and I'm almost a little bit excited about it because it's like you're going to get this amazing experiment to see how these all pan out. Yeah, what's going to happen here? But ultimately, we're talking about human beings at the end of the day, so let's not get too excited about that. But the reality is, I do think it is different depending on the kind of organisation you are, depending on, how you work, how you operate. And let's face it, before this whole crisis started, there were businesses that operated 100% virtually, and that was the way they operated. Anyway, I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all that this is going to work for everyone, but I do think what is important is as you go into this with intentionality, that you have thought through what is going to work for your organisation. And it's interesting from an EY perspective, and, we employ, 300,000 people around the world, 10,000 people across Oceania. And for the Oceania business, when we faced into this, we said, we're great at, giving our clients advice on what we think they should do with their businesses, but we thought this is really important. So we pulled our best consultants in to work on this project for us. And we said, okay, what does this mean for us as a business?
How are you going to handle it?
How are we going to handle this? And we looked at it around 3 different areas: workforce, workplace, and work smart. So workforce, what is the future of work for our business? What do we think this is going to look like for our people? What does that mean for place? But office, home, wherever they're working, what does that mean around our strategy around place? And how do we think about work smart? How are we ensuring that people are well, they're productive, and that the technology is there to enable this and bring it together? So we got our exec together and got all of them around the table. And, the starting point was we all had really different views on what this should all look like. We then went and did focus groups across our business with every different rank, level, service line to get a perspective of what our people want. Then we went out and looked at a whole bunch of data and research, and we're still working through that. We finished the first phase and we landed on the office as a connector. That's what works for our business. So this is why you come to the office and these are the kinds of things you'll do. people will land on that. There is a spectrum, and we've mapped out that spectrum and the different sort of typologies that would sit across that spectrum. And it will be different for different organisations, but making sure that decision has been done, not just by what a certain CEO's perspective might be, or someone, someone on the, it's informed by the evidence, and it's informed by thinking of your people. The other thing that I think is fascinating right now is, and again, great problem to have, but the economy has come back so strongly here in Australia. The job market is such that you really have to listen to your people. And if you start sort of mandating this is what you'll do, and that's not what your people want, in a tight labour market, that will be interesting. And the war for talent, I think, is really real at the moment. So that's an important
That's the second time today someone's talked to me about that, the war for talent question. Because I think there's two angles to that, isn't it? One, international travel is going to be difficult for a long period of time. And the second one is that despite the fact that international borders at the moment might be closed, the economies that have done well with the pandemic are going to be the most attractive to the most talented. And, we have the benefit of an exceptional living standard already in Australia. We've got a relatively strong fiscal position in terms of our public sector. We've got very strong companies that seem to be pushing into Asia. So you want to be getting the workplace question right in order to allow that war for talent globally to happen. And the second observation I sort of made recently and would make is that the internationalization of our supply chains is definitely under review as well. And you mentioned all the sectors you work in as well. I was shocked when we were looking at the fact that Australia doesn't produce any ball bearings, none, right? We had one, mask manufacturing facility in Shepparton or something, right? That was a bit of a shock to Australians. Our strategic oil reserve is stored in the United States, right, which is not really that useful to us, I would suggest. So I think we are going through a fundamental shift in thinking about what sovereignty really is and what does international trade really mean and what does talent enhancement mean. And I think the workplace has a big role to play. And in fact, I was talking to some of our tenants here at Barangaroo, who are all large firms, and they were saying their biggest concern about the pandemic and the shift home was that their young people weren't getting the sort of mentoring, weren't getting the sort of deal exposure that you would ordinarily get by being thrown in the deep end and, being up all night, doing a deal that, all of us who work in this sort of space have been involved in. Do you get the same type of training in those early years that you would otherwise get if you're sort of not in the office? And I thought that was a really valid concern, and it applies to all different skill sets. It's not just consultants or property executives or developers or lawyers. It's the same type of professional services question, I think, that comes into play here. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think it's that we sort of turn to that learning by osmosis, just by the absorption and being around. And I was speaking to someone recently who said to me, some of the best career advice I've ever had was in the back of a taxi on the way to an airport, because you're in there with, senior partner or whoever it is, and you just get them in that moment. So I do think there is something in that. I think, though, we've got to find other ways to supplement for that, to think about different ways to still be able to do that in a virtual world. But being, leaning into the fact that human-to-human contact has a real place, and thinking about how you actually make that happen. And I've, spoken to folks who have a bit of an unscheduled day and just sort of do impromptu Teams catch-ups and do that virtually. There was a whole lot of chat around, I got to know so much more about people's personal lives because you're kind of in their kitchen and their living room. And so there's some other aspects to that, but I do think
there have been some rather unfortunate cases too.
There have really
the Canadian politician who was getting dressed for his run and ended up being broadcast into Parliament as a consequence.
I think my favourite one was the one about that, the virtual court. Did you say one where the guy had the cat filter on?
I didn't see that.
Oh, I'll send that to you. That was hilarious. But yeah, there's been some absolute comedy gold, hasn't there?
I felt very sorry for that Canadian politician. Actually, he was. I can't remember what he was doing, but he literally had just gone for a run and was sort of getting dressed. Didn't realise his camera was on and was broadcast.
Yeah. We've all had those moments where you think, did I actually just turn my camera off before in a quick check? But yes, it's, definitely don't want to be caught on the wrong side of that one.
No, but then again, I mean, there are lots of benefits. I mean, we, as a global company, for us, I think the technology has brought teams more together. So, I work with a team of people who are largely based in Asia. And so, we would have, at the height of the pandemic, we would have sort of Friday night drinks, so to speak, even though the time zones were different. And at some point we'd have 4 countries represented, on a call. And that was interesting as well. It is a bit of a social experiment itself because it was sort of a blend of cultures and as well as a blend of people on this call. And so there are benefits to it.
Yes.
But I do wonder whether that was a point in time of us trying to respond to a particular thing. And the pandemic is not over. I mean, look at what's going on in India and even to the extent in the United States, which is going through a vaccination program right now. It isn't over.
Yes.
We seem to forget that here a little bit because we worry about one case, whereas, I don't know what the number is in India today, but it's far in excess of a single case.
Yeah. No, we've been truly lucky, and lucky is the wrong word because it came from good policy and decisions and government sort of making the right calls, but it also came from a highly compliant population that did what they were asked to do. And I think it's really interesting because you've got the Australian sort of larrikinism sort of culture, but I actually think it tracks back to that mateship piece of like, we will do the right thing for our communities. Yeah, and and you need both of those things. You need the right policy and government directives, and then you need the people to come on board and do what they've been asked to do. And I think how we see this sort of pan out through this next phase is now going to be really interesting because we have done an incredible job. And I spend a lot of time on the phone, the old school, on the computer screen, working with colleagues and working on projects that are not based in Australia. And everyone, when can we come on holidays? And, when are we going to see you? When can you come to New York next? And it's just at the moment, it's like, well, not for the foreseeable. And that is, we understand why we're in that situation. But I think how we open back up and how we ensure that we maximise this incredible brand that we have built and create Australia as this incredible place to come to bring your best ideas and attract the best talent and to create opportunities based off what a great job we have done in managing the crisis. I think it's going to be interesting to see how we kind of
I agree. And I was pleased to see in the budget yesterday, and I haven't had a chance to go through all of it, but the 2 elements that stood out for me was this investment in digital, the patent box concept. That's a pretty new thing for us. We've had the Cooperative Research Centre, we've had lots of innovation grants, right? We've never really liked this idea of tax incentives for patents, tax incentives for startups. We've been slow as a country to get to that, right? I mean, you see it in the United States, you see it elsewhere, but we've been slow to get to that. I think that the public sector now recognizing the value of its contribution to that is a really big step forward to us. And it's in a couple of sectors. I mean, health and medical research is one and clean energy is the other, but it will grow. I think it will grow to prop tech and things like that as well, because I think those are all export opportunities for us. But I think that's actually a good segue into some of the research you've been doing. So to quote you again, you said recently that the places of business need to be transformed into centers of experience. And I found that a really interesting concept because I think pre-pandemic, people felt the city was the city. You came to the city, you worked in the city, you might go out for a drink, and you didn't really necessarily think of the experience. And you only really recognize something when you've lost it. So we sort of lost the experience of the city. We lost the experience of being with one another. So how do we do that? How do we set ourselves up to be a center of experience? And I know you've gone with the Property Council into a report, so that's setting you up to go into this report.
Yeah, look, it's been a fascinating process working through that report because as we've sort of touched on already, there's such a diversity of views and perspectives and opinions, and there's never been so much written about future of office, future of the city.
And it's everywhere. Some
of
it is noise, I must say, right? Some of it is...
I don't disagree. Yeah. And the purpose behind the report was really wanting to say, let's just take stock. So let's go and do some primary research, so we surveyed 600 CBD users. Let's go out and speak to some of the big thinkers, both here and overseas, in terms of what they're thinking, sensing, seeing. We reviewed over 100 papers, and then we ran focus groups. And so we brought all of that together, and I can tell you it was quite the beast of a project, shall we say. And then really look to sort of synthesize that perspective and say, this is where we think this is going to go when we look at it from an Australian perspective, reflective of all of those views and perspectives and government. We spoke to government, we spoke to private sector, we spoke to industry bodies. So bringing that all together into that report. And essentially, as you say, that's what it's about. You know, this whole central business district, the giveaway is in the title. It was about business. They've been built for business. And we know they're absolute economic powerhouses, and that needs to continue to be part of the equation. And we know the economics of agglomeration and why that is so important. But we proved that business can roll on without necessarily being in a CBD. So it is about thinking about how we move it beyond business and think about why you come. And you think about those great cities in the world. And again, I'm going back to my city file piece here. You know, those cool cities in the world, those centres, they're not just about business. Right. They've got other stuff going on. And you might even go into an office building, but you end up sort of going up some lifts and ending up in some really cool rooftop bar. And it's different and unexpected. And you walk down some little alleyway and there's a shop, you know, selling buttons. Like it's those, you know, unique experiences that make it different and interesting and that attract people there. And interestingly, you know, I was speaking to Mike Rodriguez the other day, who's the new 24-hour commissioner for Sydney. And he was saying...
Cool role, right? The commissioner for 24 hours.
I know, it was pretty cool. I was actually saying to Michael on a panel with him the other day, I was like, yeah, bright purple sneakers on. And I was like, I'm really going to have to up my sneaker game next time I come to meet with you. But, you know, Mike was saying in his role, what he's talking about is the test of the CBD. He wants to see more prams and wheelchairs. And what he's talking about there is from the very young to the very old. And wanting to see that multi-generational perspective of why you would come to a CBD. What is it about a CBD that is going to attract you to come? And so I think that is going to be really fascinating to see how that plays out. But I also think it needs to be about experience, even if you go back to that central premise that it's for business. To attract the worker, it needs to be about experience. If I can come and have a pretty similar day to what I'm going to have at home, why bother?
Yeah.
Have to pay for my transport, have to pay for lunch, and I've lost probably some time in the commute. Why would I do that? Like it makes no sense. I get home,
my kids are exhausted, I'm exhausted. What's the benefit, right?
So, but I will go if when I go, that experience of working when I go to the office is way better or different than what I've had at home. And again, I probably want to mix. I don't want to maybe be in 5 days a week anymore. And that's what the research is telling us. Yeah. But when I come in, that was fantastic. Because I think there's been some experiences that people have come in and been like, yeah, that just didn't quite hit the mark. Why did I bother coming in?
Well, particularly if you're coming in just to sit on video conference. Right?
Absolutely.
Like, so I will stay home. If I've got a day of video conference, I'll stay home.
Yep.
And the reason why is because I can pick the kids up from school.
Yes.
Right? I can, that's not something I ever got to do.
Yep.
Right. Now, post-pandemic, and the number of stories of fathers and mothers who've sort of said that. It's not something I ever got to do, right? Pick the kids up from school.
And people have loved that,
and they love it, right? And that flexibility is something we've earned.
Yes.
And we should keep that.
Yes.
I think employers now have also changed their mindset around working hours, for example. Do you remember the old days when I started work? It was there was presenteeism.
Completely.
You had to be there at 8:30.
Yes.
Right. And if you
7 ideally, Jason.
6:30, right? And if you're not there, then you weren't really committed somehow, right? You should be there at 9 o'clock at night because otherwise you're not committed. Well, clearly that's always been nonsense, right? I mean,
completely. And it's had really bad impacts on diversity.
Terrible.
Like that's why we've struggled in the sector to make sure we've got good female representation because they'll just say, sorry, I'm just not going to make that sacrifice. It's
not something I'm willing to buy.
Not something I'm willing to do. And again, we know some of the mental health impacts even for men and women of like the things they've missed out on. And you sort of think, doesn't have to be.
Well, I mean, certainly from a father's perspective, absolutely missing out on basic things like asking your kids, what they did at school, which I found, having the same age children as you do, is actually quite a difficult thing to get out of them.
It is.
Like, I don't remember. I don't remember. You don't remember. You were there half an hour.
What did you learn today? Nothing.
Nothing.
Okay, great.
Well, this is a great school. But quite seriously though, and I think that for me has been part of the learning experience as well, because I think the amount of time I've spent with my children has actually changed my perspective on work a bit as well. It actually makes me think differently about property, around what we're trying to do, around placemaking, around the capability of people to come in and use buildings and use cities. And you know, my friend and colleague Richard Kupasamy came on this podcast before you. You know, he's a wheelchair user. He talks about the fact that, you know, wheelchair users often have to use side accesses or other ways of doing things. And an accessible city is actually one where that doesn't exist. You can just kind of use it, use the city, right? Yep. That's the same for pram users.
Exactly.
Or, you know, it's the same for elderly people.
Absolutely.
So that to me is, and also the other point to make, so as in an Asian population, as so many of our cities are, if that means longevity in the workplace, then
absolutely
the place also has to adjust to that as well. So I think there's a bunch of dynamics. You know, you had a couple of things here around redefining quality and reimagining the workplace. So I think we've talked a bit about reimagining what the workplace is, but let's delve into that a bit more around how do you combine the use of technology, video, for example, with being in a workplace. So we run an open plan workplace here. Everyone at the moment has their computer in front of them. They've got their headphones in. One school of thought, people were on phones before, weren't they? So what's the big deal? Other school of thought actually isn't going to work. Is active working dead?
Look, it's been scratchy. That would be my technical description of what the
scratchy's good.
Of what the
and that's
return,
not a reference to the line, right?
So, what the return has been like in making this hybrid thing work. Like, we've had a real battle for meeting rooms, and it doesn't work. The like, you know, that activity based working, with generally major open plan, lots of individual sort of workstations, just doesn't. It honestly doesn't really work that well. The problem as well is, what is the new model? And again, I've not seen as much as I would have liked to have seen around some of the innovation in that space. And then what's the technology layer that then supports that? Interestingly, we remodeled one of our floors at 200 George Street and have set it up around this view around place to task. So where is the best place to do the task I need to do now?
Very interesting.
Not the task I need to do all day, because the fact of the matter is, for many of us, and not everyone, we do different tasks within the day. And so when you walk out of the lifts, there is like a bank of, like, there's a workstation that pretty much faces the lift. And I work there when I first get in the morning before I start my first meeting. And what I'm saying is, I am highly interruptible right now. I am doing some emails, but I actually want to say, oh, hey, and speak to people and check in.
So don't wait for the corridor conversation.
Yeah, so, and I, like, you don't sit there unless you want to be interrupted. Then we've got areas where there's big groups of desks where you can sit around like basically a big circle table and all work together. So if you're working on a project, you all sit there and work together, and they're spread out enough that it's not, you know, too noisy. We then have a large classroom area which can be curtained off, and you can fit quite a large number of people there for a learning and development environment, which is, again, one of the things we think that people should come together for. And then down in the back, there is the quiet pods, no calls, no nothing. And then there's sort of the meeting rooms.
We have focus stations. Right?
Exactly. But on this floor, I will sit in 4 different spots
in
within a day.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so you don't just put your laptop in and forget about it. You move around depending on what you need to get done, that place to task bit. And then who knows, probably at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, traffic's not too bad. If I've had to driving, because I've dropped a kid at early morning sport, I will get in the car and go home and do my last 2 hours, which I know are Teams meetings, from home. So again, that place to task balancing, I think, is going to be really critical. But we need the technology to work and to make that seamless. The other thing we need the technology to do is to help us coordinate. And we all get those little Microsoft reminders. Hey, you said you were going to do this, or you've got this meeting today. Have you read this document? And there's a big power in that around taking that the next step further to be like, you look like you're going to be working from home on Friday. Do you realise that half your team is in the office. Maybe you should go in. And how does the technology help us sort of flatten that working week curve and help us sort of make those incidental connections in a more purposeful way? Like, Facebook knows who we should be friends with and LinkedIn knows who we should connect with. How is the technology layer doing that for us within the workplace of creating?
I do have a bit of I don't want to say contrarian view, concern about some of that, because I do feel that task example where you have this task list, which I use task list, sure, but you get these reminders and then you get a text message and you get it sort of it starts to become a bit overbearing. Yeah. And I think it depends on your personality. There is a real risk of that. Right? So if you're the type of technical mind that responds very well to very structured thinking, then that model works well. But if you're not, and you're sort of a bit more unstructured, you're a bit more creative, you're used to bumping into each other, and you're not very good at that sort of structured task thing, that may not work for you. And so I think there is some. Well, and I think I probably fall in the middle of that somewhere, because I find the structure. I need the structure because I will fail without it, but I don't like it. And
I think it's also, though, even for that unstructured component, and again, it depends on the size and scale of your organisation, but there could be a bunch of people in the EY office today that if I knew they were there, I'd probably go and hunt them down and have a chat. I just don't know they're there. Like there's just that bit around. It comes down to good luck. So you walk in, you bump, oh, hey, I haven't seen you for ages, and you start chatting and you solve some problem you didn't know you had. But it's just good luck. And you can have the reverse of that day of come in and bump into no one that is particularly of relevance, and you think, oh, that was a waste of time. I just think, how do we remove that luck element of whether the day in the office was a kind of productive, useful day or a bit of a probably could have stayed at home
I had
today.
An experience just before this meeting, actually, where an announcement was made on something, and I just sent a text message to somebody who I work with. Hey, look at this thing. We hadn't spoken in 6 months or something. He was 2 desks down from me. Right, and
you had beep beep. Oh,
right. Oh, right. And he's very rarely on the level with me. He just happened to be there that day. And sort of same example, right? Yeah. So it is actually really difficult to sort of meet the sort of people you need to. And I think the building design has a lot to do with that. I mean, here we really focused on our very large floor plates, on having connecting stairs between levels, right? And having a crash floor, right? So this level 13 crash floor is about people being able to come and sit in this sort of cafe area and actually have a conversation that maybe is safe enough that it's not out in the complete public space, but is sort of here. And the same with our level 14 area here is about allowing our clients and customers to come and just hang out up there. Like I think you mentioned you were doing that earlier. That's what we want. We want our people to come in here, and that's part of it. Now let's go a little bit to greenery. Yes. So we're big on greenery here. We like green. Yes, the team's put a lovely plant here. Why does that matter in a workplace? Is it just plants in a building?
It's what's not the impact? Even in a workplace. Like, it is so important. And it came out in the research we did for the CBD report. So that was the number one thing people told us would attract them back to the CBD. Greenery. Yep. And you go, wow. Yet we know often when projects start, we have these great plans and we budget all this stuff in, it can often be one of those things that then sort of disappears as we sort of tighten the screws on a project.
I've heard a few firms sort of letting their plants disappear.
And but even in the public realm, so when we're doing sort of a big, urban regen project or the tram line or whatever it is, and everyone's like, yes, we need lots of trees, and then as we work through the practicality of it, it all gets a bit hard, and what was going to be 100 trees turns into 3. And that's just one example of it. But it was absolutely, people want their CBDs to be green. And green, we're talking about 2 things. We're talking about the real practical, like literally green with plants and trees and green spaces and parks to go, but also the green credentials of the building. Does my building not do damage to the environment? And does it actually am I actually a healthier, more well person when I leave the building than when I walked in at the start of the day?
That's a really interesting concept, isn't it? The idea of coming to work will actually mean that I'm better off.
Exactly. And you look at some of the oxygen and the way we look after the air quality and, buildings like the one we're sitting in right now.
The walking meeting, which I thought was ridiculous when I first heard about it, but actually I do it all the time. Because you can around Barangaroo. It's beautiful. Why wouldn't you have your one-on-one with somebody going around there?
Well, and, the yoga classes and all, Pilates and all that stuff. But how do I feel like, and again, you contrast it to, I sat at home in my house, in my seat that's probably not that ergonomically fantastic, in front of a screen, all day, or I've come to the office where the oxygen quality in the office is fantastic. I did a yoga class at lunchtime. I went to the office cafe and got a really healthy, nutritionally balanced snack as opposed to a bit of peanut butter toast at home. I am going to walk out that door and be like, I'm healthier than if I had done that sort of same day.
And I feel ready to deal with my home life now, right?
Exactly.
Awake and ready to go.
I think that's important. And I think that's sort of the here and now. But I think what I particularly am fascinated in around the sort of the digital twin stuff as well, Jason, is how that is going to help move us forward around getting towards net zero. And your new incoming global CEO, Tony, I saw posted on that on LinkedIn this week, and I was just like, yes.
Yeah, he's very big. He's very, very big on our whole digital capability.
Yeah, and that digital connection, like we just cannot get there unless we have that digital technology that will allow us to, you know, see through those commitments that we're making. And again, you know, COVID was interesting, right? I was so fearful that this would mean that we would just forget all about that work for a while. And it would be like, we have this, you know, immediate crisis to deal with, but actually it really focused us. We think this is bad. Wait till you see what's coming if we don't deal with climate change. And we saw major corporations actually double down on their commitments. And we saw, you know, multiple announcements. We've seen, you know, the continued push of, you know, BlackRock and others to really focus on this. And I think that is interesting because the real estate sector is a bit of the sleeping giant, like 40% contribution to, you know, global carbon emissions. Like, that is huge. And
never spoken about either, right?
Someone just, there was an article I read the other day that described as the quiet sinner.
Yes.
And I was like, oh, yes, that's probably a very, very visceral image there, but it's going to be real. And I think the challenges, again, are significant, but it's going to be kind of, you know, table stakes in terms of, particularly for all of the major employers, you will not go into a building unless it is able to set absolute sort of gold standards around climate commitments.
There's a few angles to this, right? We are in an A-grade building here, triple A-grade building here. But the majority of the city is not A-grade. Majority of cities are not A-grade, particularly in some of the emerging markets, right? Where the same demands that you would think of workers here will be in those cities as well, particularly, you know, in the war for talent. So if we're thinking about a net zero world or a carbon positive world, like I was talking to somebody today about the Olympic Games. The Olympic Games mandate is to have a carbon positive games, right? Imagine the challenge of that. That means that your existing infrastructure and your existing buildings, all of a sudden, you can't just demolish those things and go away. That is a highly carbon intensive process. So, you know, what do you do with concrete, for example? You can't just recycle concrete. You can, but it's a highly expensive process. So you've got to find a way of retrofitting, repurposing buildings. You know, look, AMP's tower here, they kept the core, for example. Right? That's, you know, people thought, my goodness, that's outrageous. You know, but actually that has worked, right? A beautiful building coming up there, and it has kept the core. That to me is the beauty of what digital twin offers, right? The scenario testing of it means that from a development commercial assessment building point of view, and the ability to virtually design, virtually test, virtually see integration opportunities is how, in fact, in my mind, the only way we can really understand how sustainability will work in the real world. It's not something we've really done before. And the integration part, I think, is the bit that we've been missing, because we often design things without necessarily understanding what the broader impact on the city might be from X or Y. We have some understanding. And you'll be familiar with every environmental assessment report that we put out. It goes from here to here, but it doesn't think about over there. Its mandate is not to do that.
Yes.
Right. So that actually is a nice segue then into a little bit on public policy. So both your firm and ours, we do a lot of work with government partners. You know, the public sector is invaluable in this whole debate, and it's interesting your point around the corporate sector moving towards net zero, because I have a view that actually that's giving elected officials space to come on this journey, because it is not an easy political issue, and having the space to do that is important. But what do you think the role of the public sector is in achieving the opening up of our cities, of achieving the experience that you were talking about? And I know the first thing I will say is the removal of the lockout laws for the city of Sydney, I think will be beneficial in this debate. So I think we can treat it. So now that that's happened, what's next?
Look, I think it's fascinating in terms of some of what we're seeing emerge. And if you look, I think one of the great examples we've got at the moment is you look at the creation of Investment New South Wales. So a new agency which has been created under Amy Brown's leadership as CEO. Yep. So huge amounts of energy is being put into what is it going to take for New South Wales to absolutely thrive off the back of what we've been through, this incredible brand that we've created, our ability to manage through COVID, but how do we now get the payback on that? And I think if you look at the mandate for Investment New South Wales, which is the whole of the state, but there is a very specific focus around precincts, placemaking and CBDs. And I think that is really important because what we need government to do is help create the frameworks and the policies and the incentives and the regulations that can facilitate what needs to happen. And, you know, the interesting piece of the report that we did, when you go out and you look at it all and you speak to people, it's kind of clear what we need to do. And then we just need government to help us create the right incentives and frameworks and policies for us to get on with it. And I think the piece around how we then think about safely opening Australia up to be able to attract the right talent and to bring in capital to absolutely make this a place where people want to come and can see the kind of contribution they can make to Australia's future is really important. And I think the opportunity, around, and you touched on it before, that innovation piece, to create that opportunity for innovation and for talent, that is what will separate us. And we've got a great track record at the innovations. We have managed to pull out of what is, a large landmass, but, tiny population, relatively speaking. How do we incentivize more of that? And for those people, and they've got their brilliant ideas, to stay here and thrive here and to get the full benefit of that, I think is key.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, the two observations I would make first on the policy setting is I'm really proud of the way Australian governments have approached infrastructure development now towards precincts.
Yep.
If you think 10 years ago, we weren't talking about precincts, right? We were talking about precincts in terms of, here's this old port for Barangaroo, go and redevelop that port, right? We didn't think of the public sector as building a very, very large piece of infrastructure, Sydney Metro West, Western Sydney Airport. And we're really, truly thinking around what's going to go around it and what the economic benefit of that is going to be. And so I think, and same with Cross River Rail in Brisbane, same with the Melbourne Metro, there's been a lot of thinking in the public sector around how to achieve productivity benefits as a consequence of infrastructure development. Yes. So I think that's a really positive thing. And I think as Australians, we should be very proud of how mature our public sector has been around that. But the second thing I think that has been really interesting is when I moved here in 97 from Hong Kong, where I grew up, and my first observation of Australians and Australia was there was a hunger.
Yeah.
It was a hunger. There was an aggression here. There had been a recession.
Yeah.
The 90s recession was terrible for this country. And, people had felt it. People were still recovering from it. But there was an aggression. We are going to fight this and get out of it. And the narrative often around Australia is, we benefited from commodities booms and that's the only reason why we've been successful. I tend to disagree because I think Australians are a very innovative and a very hungry people. And we have benefited from wealth that has been given to the country by resources. But now is the chance to actually convert that into something beyond that. And I think we're starting to see a lot of this narrative. So we talked a little bit about, this new move into the patent box, the Treasurer called it. That is the right thing. The more aggression on cooperative research centres. Lend-Lease is part of one, for example, right? Building 4.0, I think we call it, but I'm sure I got that right. And I think for us in the corporate sector and those of us who are involved in these debates, that's where the opportunity is for us to keep encouraging, keep pushing, keep leading, because I think that's what will help us be successful as a country. Yeah. Which is why I think your contribution with this report and more broadly is so valuable, because it gives people space to debate. And it's actually why I started this podcast, same reason, because I thought, if we allow these debates to happen in sound bites, you never really get
into the heart of it,
or a full discussion or a full understanding in the market of how to go forward. We'll have to end soon, and it's been, as always, a fascinating conversation.
Been great.
But you do a lot of thinking around this. I wanted to leave the last word to you. If I was to ask you 3 things that we should do as a country to get ahead, given I've just given this wonderful narrative around how wonderful Australia is,
what would it be? Look, it's probably the stuff we have touched on, but if I was going to sort of really succinctly put it into 3, it is innovation. Like, we have got to go from that mentality of we are the lucky country to we are the clever country. We've got the goods. We've got to capitalise on them. I think the other one would be around green. I think we've been a little slow to kind of work out where we're going here in pockets, and we need more around that. But I think we have a really exciting opportunity if we invest, particularly around the technology space, to lead there. And the third area is talent, because we can't do the first 2 unless we've got people who are smart and enabled to act on that. And that is ensuring that for people that are already in the country, that we're giving them the best opportunities to retrain, to bring their ideas to life here. And not only that, that we're attracting the world's top talent and we can get them into the country and be known as a destination for the world's best and brightest.
I agree entirely. Selina, it's been so nice to have you on the podcast.
Thanks.
Hopefully you'll come back again. I think there's a lot more areas we could go into.
Yes, it's been great.
Well, it's great. But for the moment, Selina Short, thank you so much for coming on the Autonomous Now podcast.
Thanks, Jason. It's been great.